The scream echoed through the airport terminal, cutting the air like a sharp blade. Bomb. There's a bomb? The crowd panicked, running in all directions as security guards tried to maintain order. Amidst the chaos, one man remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the digital clock reading 5:43 p.m. Richard Carter knew he had only 2 minutes to prevent a tragedy. 2 hours earlier, he was just another invisible homeless man in society's eyes. Now hundreds of lives depended on him. Flashing back a few hours, the biting January wind whipped through the international terminal as 62-year-old Richard huddled in his usual corner, pulling his threadbare coat closer around his body. His calloused hands, marked by decades of electrical work, gripped a lukewarm cup of coffee, a gift from Emily, the young cafe attendant who occasionally remembered his existence. The airport had become his makeshift home for the past 8 months. During the day, he was just another shadow among the thousands of hurried passengers, wheeling their luggage and chasing travel dreams. At night, when the crowds dwindled, he found peace in the dimly lit corners of the terminal, where the security guards, already familiar with his silent presence, pretended not to see him. In his moments of solitude, Richard often found himself reminiscing about his previous life. The memory of the day he wore his navy blue uniform with the golden maintenance supervisor badge for the last time still haunted him. 25 years of dedicated service that ended abruptly when the company decided younger, cheaper employees could do his job. Corporate restructuring, they said, handing him a pink slip and a cold handshake. The moment was seared into his memory: the sterile office, the HR manager avoiding eye contact, the sense of unreality as he emptied his desk. That day, Richard lost not just his job, but his identity, his purpose, his dignity. The following months were a slow-motion nightmare. The savings carefully accumulated over the years melted away like snow in the sun. The rent fell behind once, then twice. The bills piled up like a mountain of paper threatening to suffocate him. Every job interview was a new disappointment. Overqualified, they would say, a polite euphemism for too old. The final blow came when he discovered his retirement had been siphoned away in a fraudulent scheme. The impersonal letter arrived, informing him that hundreds of employees had lost their lifetime savings. Richard remembered sitting for hours, staring at that piece of paper that represented the death of his last dreams. Margaret, his wife of 30 years, tried to be strong at first. She took a part-time job at a department store, trying to keep the bills paid. But watching her husband sink deeper into depression was too much. One morning, Richard woke up to find only a note: "I can't bear to watch you destroy yourself. Forgive me." The apartment was the next to go. Then the car. The furniture was sold one piece at a time, each one carrying a memory of happier times. The only thing Richard couldn't bring himself to part with was his toolbox, a gift from his father when he started in the profession, and a few photos of better days. The world Richard once knew had shrunk to a corner in the airport and a backpack containing his last possessions. An old notebook served as a technical journal, where he still jotted down notes on circuits and electrical systems, a habit he refused to abandon. A photo of him and Margaret at his supervisor graduation, both smiling, unaware of the future that lay ahead. Social invisibility was something that still surprised him, even after so much time on the streets. It was both fascinating and painful how people developed an almost supernatural ability to not see him. Executives in expensive suits would pass by as if he were a piece of furniture. Mothers would pull their children closer as he approached. Security guards would watch him with a mix of pity and suspicion. Emily was the exception. The young cafe attendant treated him like a human, not a problem to be avoided. Sometimes she would bring him coffee, other times leftover sandwiches that would have been thrown out anyway. More important than the food was the genuine smile, the way she asked if he was doing all right, as if his answer truly mattered. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons that everything changed. Richard was in his usual spot, a discreet corner near column 47, where he could observe the activity without drawing attention. The location had the added advantage of being near an outlet, where he occasionally charged the small radio he had repaired, his only connection to the outside world. The voices came first as a murmur in a language he didn't recognize. Years on the streets had sharpened his instincts, and something in those voices instantly put him on alert. He remained motionless, becoming even more invisible than he already was. 2 men stopped near his column, continuing a tense conversation in low tones. Through the reflection in the window of the closed store in front of him, Richard could observe them without being noticed. They were dressed casually, but something in their posture betrayed an unusual tension. It was when one of them quickly opened a backpack that Richard's world was turned upside down. His years of experience with electrical circuits made his brain instantly process what his eyes had captured. Colorful wires organized in a specific pattern, a digital timer, and components that definitely did not belong to any common equipment. The training he had received years ago as a maintenance supervisor came back to him with crystalline clarity. The pattern of the wires, the arrangement of the components, everything indicated a sophisticated improvised explosive device. His heart raced, but years of professional experience kept him outwardly calm. The men continued their conversation, completely oblivious to his presence. Amidst the foreign language, some English words stood out: Gate 23, 545, and the phrase that made his blood run cold: full flight. The reality of the situation hit him with full force. There he was, a man society had discarded as useless, holding information that could save hundreds of lives. But who would believe a homeless man? How could he convince the authorities about a terrorist threat without being immediately dismissed as disturbed or troublemaking? "Sir? Are you all right?" Emily's soft voice brought him back to reality. The young attendant stood before him, holding a new steaming cup of coffee. It was then that Richard noticed something on her badge he had never seen before: Security Supervisor in Training. The digital clock on the wall read 3:37 p.m. 2 hours and 8 minutes until the time he had heard in the conversation. Time seemed simultaneously too much and too little. In his mind, the oath he had made so many years ago echoed with renewed strength: to protect and serve no matter the cost. "Emily, I need your help. And I need you to trust me." The clock continued its relentless march towards 5:45 p.m., and a race against time was about to begin. A race where the unlikely hero was a man society had chosen to ignore, but fate had placed in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge to make a difference. Emily led Richard to a more secluded area of the terminal, near the janitor's closet. The narrow corridor, lit by flickering fluorescent lights, was empty except for an abandoned cleaning cart. Richard could sense the young woman's hesitation. After all, why would a security supervisor trainee believe a homeless man? "Mr. Richard, what's so urgent?" Emily asked, nervously adjusting her badge. Her eyes shifted between his face and the hallway, as if torn between the duty to listen and the instinct to flee. Richard took a deep breath, weighing his words carefully. He knew he had only one chance. "Emily, I know this will sound crazy, but you need to hear me out. I just witnessed two men discussing a plan to blow up a plane. Gate 23 at 5:45. Emily's face hardened instantly. "Mr. Richard, this is a very serious matter. I can't." Red and blue wires connected to a TX-440 digital timer, Richard interrupted, his voice adopting the professional tone he hadn't used in years. "Series configuration with parallel redundancy. Secondary detonator linked to a pressure system. I know what I saw, Emily. I spent 25 years working with electrical circuits." The change in his voice from pleading homeless man to technical expert made Emily pause. "How do you know so much about?" "Because I was a maintenance supervisor at the power plant. I attended all the anti-terrorism training. I know how to identify an IED when I see one." Richard pulled a worn notebook from his bag, opening to a page where he had just sketched a schematic of the device he saw. "Here, this is the configuration I observed. The timer is connected to..." Emily examined the drawing, her eyes gradually widening. As part of her security training, she had studied similar diagrams. The technical accuracy of the sketch was undeniable. "Why didn't you alert security directly?" she asked, still hesitant but now more attentive. Richard gave a bitter laugh. "Ever tried, as a homeless man, to convince a guard that you've uncovered a terrorist plot? Best case, I'd be ignored. Worst case, arrested for causing a panic." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Emily quickly pushed Richard behind a stack of boxes as a cleaning crew member passed by, whistling distractedly. "We need proof," Emily whispered after the worker had gone. "I can't just trigger the emergency protocol based on..." "I know where they are," Richard interrupted. "I saw where they went. I can show you, but we need to be discreet. If they realize they've been discovered..." Emily bit her lip, clearly fighting an internal battle. Her training told her to follow protocol, report the suspicion to her superiors. But something about Richard's technical precision, the controlled urgency in his voice, made her want to trust him. "Give me 5 minutes," she decided finally. "I'll get back up." "No." Richard grabbed her arm, quickly letting go as he realized the abrupt gesture. "Sorry, but we can't risk it. They have a lookout. If they see suspicious security movement..." A group of passengers passed through the corridor, animatedly discussing their destinations. Richard and Emily remained silent until the footsteps faded. The clock on the wall read 4:05 p.m. "You're asking me to ignore all security protocols," Emily said slowly, "and trust solely the word of someone who society has discarded?" Richard finished, his voice laced with years of bitterness. "Yes, I am. Because in this moment, I'm the only one who knows what's about to happen. And you're the only one who can help me stop it." Emily looked at the clock, then the technical drawing, and finally into Richard's eyes. The years on the streets had not extinguished the professional determination that still shone within them. "If I find out this is some kind of... You can personally hand me over to security if I'm wrong," Richard promised. "But if I'm right and we don't do anything?" The weight of those unspoken words hung between them like a dark cloud. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, making her decision. "Show me," she said finally. "But we'll need a plan." Richard nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "They're using the old cargo terminal as a meeting point. It's a restricted area, but I know how to get in without being seen." "How do you know so much about the airport's layout?" Emily asked as they began to move discreetly through the corridors. "When you live on the streets, knowing every nook and cranny can mean the difference between a dry night and one in the rain," Richard explained. "Plus, old inspection habits never die." They moved like shadows through the less crowded corridors, Richard guiding with a familiarity that surprised Emily. Each corner was checked before proceeding, every movement calculated to avoid drawing attention. Approaching the cargo terminal, Richard signaled for Emily to stop. Through a dirty window, they could see activity inside the abandoned hangar. 3 men were gathered around an improvised table, with a backpack identical to the one Richard had seen open. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her hand instinctively going to the radio on her belt. "You were right." "Wait," Richard stopped her from grabbing the radio. "We need to know more. If we alert them now, they may have accomplices we don't know about." As if to confirm his words, a 4th man entered the hangar, carrying what appeared to be an airport staff uniform. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "They have inside access. And there are probably more than just one," Richard murmured, his decades of industrial security experience coming to the surface. "In operations like this, there's always redundancy." The digital clock on his wrist showed 4:23 p.m. Time was slipping through their fingers like sand, and they still didn't have a concrete plan. The flight from Gate 23 was departing in less than an hour and a half, and somewhere in this airport, other co-conspirators could be preparing to act. "We need help," Emily whispered, "but how do we alert the authorities without causing a panic or tipping off the terrorists?" Richard watched the men in the hangar intently, his mind racing. Years of experience in maintenance and industrial security had taught him that every system has a weak point. It was just a matter of finding it. That's when he noticed something through the dirty window, a detail that could change everything. His heart raced with the realization of what needed to be done. "Emily," he said quietly, "I think I have a plan. But you're going to have to trust me completely." The young supervisor looked at him, then at the men in the hangar and back to the clock. The decision she made in the next seconds could determine the fate of hundreds. "If I'm understanding correctly," Emily whispered, her face a mix of disbelief and concern, "you want me to trigger a false emergency in the electrical system?" Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on the old distribution panel he had spotted through the hangar window. The faint light filtering through the dirty windows revealed decades of dust and neglect. But to his trained eyes, the equipment was still perfectly functional. "That panel controls all the power to this area," he explained, his fingers tracing an imaginary diagram in the air. "If we can cause a controlled overload, we can force an evacuation without causing panic. It's an old system, but I know this model well. I worked with it for years." Emily studied Richard's face, noticing how his eyes gained a different glint when talking about electrical systems. It was as if years of living on the streets momentarily disappeared, revealing the competent professional he once was. "And how exactly do you plan to do this without electrocuting us?" she asked, her voice betraying a mix of fascination and fear. The security training she had received did not cover anything like this. Richard opened his battered backpack, revealing a small toolbox carefully organized, the last vestige of his previous life. Each tool, though worn from use, was immaculately clean and orderly. Emily realized he must have made considerable sacrifices to maintain that kit, likely his most prized possession. 25 years working with high-voltage electrical systems," he said, gently caressing a screwdriver that looked well used. "I can make that panel sing opera if needed. Every system has its own language, you know? It's just a matter of listening." The plan Richard detailed in the next minutes was simultaneously simple and ingenious. A controlled overload in the electrical system would trigger the emergency protocol, leading to an evacuation of the area without alerting the terrorists to the true reason. The resulting chaos would create a window of opportunity for Emily to discreetly alert her team. "There's a maintenance entrance in the back," Richard explained, drawing a detailed map in his notebook. His strokes were precise, the result of months observing every detail of the airport. "If you can give me 5 minutes of cover, I can get in and access the panel unseen. The trick is knowing the camera blind spots." Emily studied the map, impressed by the accuracy of the details. Each corridor, service door, and access point was marked with meticulous annotations. "How do you know all this?" "Spent 8 months exploring every corner of this airport," Richard replied, a touch of bitterness in his voice. "When you live on the streets, knowledge is survival. Gotta know where it's safe to sleep, which guards are understanding, which doors stay unlocked." He paused, his eyes distant. "Funny how life teaches you lessons you never expected to need. But I need you to understand something," he continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Once I start, there's no going back. If I'm wrong about these men, you'll be arrested," Emily finished softly, comprehending for the first time the true risk Richard was taking. "And this time it won't just be for trespassing." Richard gave a bitter smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sabotaging an airport's electrical system? Domestic terrorism, critical infrastructure sabotage? I'll spend the rest of my life behind bars. And this time, it won't be in the metaphorical cell of the streets." The weight of that reality hung between them like a dark cloud. Emily looked at the man before her with new eyes. His worn clothes told a story of deprivation, but his posture still carried a dignity that circumstances had not erased. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why risk everything?" Richard was silent for a long moment, his eyes lost in memories that seemed to weigh a ton. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with contained emotion. "When I lost everything, my job, Margaret, my dignity, I thought I'd never be useful again. I thought society was right to discard me." He ran a hand over his weary face, the gesture revealing every line that marked his history. "I spent so much time feeling invisible that I almost forgot who I was. But now I can make a difference. Even if no one ever knows, even if it ends my days in a cell, at least I'll know I did something that mattered." The clock read 4:45 p.m. 1 hour until the time they had heard in the terrorist conversation. Time seemed to slip through their fingers like water. "Okay," Emily decided, her young face taking on a determined expression that made her seem older. "What's the first step?" The next minutes were a carefully choreographed dance. Emily used her badge to access restricted areas, creating strategic diversions that allowed Richard to move unnoticed. Each movement was calculated, every second precious. They moved like shadows through the less crowded corridors, Richard guiding with the familiarity of someone who knew every nook and cranny. The contrast between them was striking. Emily in her impeccable uniform, Richard in his worn clothes, united by a purpose that transcended their social differences. Reaching the distribution panel, Richard worked with the precision of a surgeon. His fingers, though trembling from the cold and age, still remembered every motion. The overload needed to be significant enough to force the evacuation, but controlled to avoid permanent damage. "Every system has a point of balance," he murmured, more to himself than to Emily, who stood guard. "It's like a dance. Push too hard, it breaks. Push too little, nothing happens. The secret is finding the exact moment." "Almost ready," he announced after a few minutes of meticulous work, connecting the last wire. "Just one more." That's when he heard approaching footsteps. His heart nearly stopped when an unknown voice echoed down the corridor. "Hey, what are you doing there?" Richard turned slowly, finding himself face to face with a man wearing a maintenance uniform. But something was off, small details only a former employee would notice. The badge was slightly crooked, the boots weren't the standard issue, and most importantly, his hands lacked the characteristic calluses of someone who works with tools. "You're not maintenance," Richard said calmly, noting the way the man gripped a wrench, not as a tool but as a weapon. Years on the streets had taught him to recognize a threat when he saw one. The imposter took a step forward. Step away from the panel. Now. Richard looked at the clock. 5:15 p.m. 30 minutes until the scheduled time. His mind raced, evaluating options. The corridor was too narrow to run, and at 62, his chances in a physical altercation were practically nil. That's when he noticed movement behind the imposter, Emily, holding a fire extinguisher with determination in her eyes. In that moment, Richard felt a wave of gratitude for the young woman who had chosen to trust him when everyone else would have ignored him. "You know the problem with living on the streets?" Richard said, taking a small step forward to keep the imposter's attention focused on him. "You become invisible. People stop noticing you." He paused dramatically, a smile forming on his weary face. "But you also learn to notice everything and everyone." Before the imposter could process the meaning of those words, Emily attacked. The extinguisher struck his back with enough force to make him stagger forward. Richard, moving with an agility that surprised even himself, dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the wrench that cut through the air. "Now?" Richard yelled, his hand finding the switch he had prepared. The moment of hesitation proved costly. He felt a sharp pain as the wrench grazed his arm, but his fingers were already in position. The electrical system protested with a deafening roar. The lights began to flicker violently, creating a strobe-like effect that transformed the corridor into a surreal scene. The sound of tripping circuit breakers echoed off the walls, and then darkness took over. Seconds later, the emergency lights came on, bathing everything in a threatening red glow. Sirens began to blare, and an automated voice announced the emergency evacuation. "Attention, this is not a drill. Please proceed calmly to the nearest exits following the instructions of the security team." In the darkness, Richard could hear the confusion spreading through the terminal. Distant shouts and the sound of hurried footsteps suggested his plan had worked, perhaps too well. The chaos of the evacuation would be both an advantage and a challenge. Emily helped Richard to his feet as the imposter's retreating steps indicated he had fled. "It worked," she said breathlessly, noticing the blood on Richard's arm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," Richard replied, though the pain was considerable. "We have bigger problems. With the evacuation, how will we find the others before they try to carry out their plan?" He gripped his toolbox tightly, his mind racing. The original plan was to use the evacuation to allow the security team to intervene discreetly, but the encounter with the imposter had changed everything. Now the terrorists knew someone was onto them. "They'll try to use the chaos to their advantage," Richard said urgently. "And that's exactly what I'm counting on them to do." In an evacuation, everyone follows emergency protocols, except those with other plans. Emily understood immediately. "Gate 23? They'll have to move now if they want to stick to their timeline." "Exactly. And with the electrical system compromised, they'll need to adapt their plan." Richard began limping towards a service stairwell, his knowledge of the airport layout more valuable than ever. There are only 3 possible routes to get to Gate 23 unnoticed during an evacuation. And I know them all. The clock continued its relentless advance. 5:25 p.m. 20 minutes to prevent a tragedy, and now the entire airport was in motion. The race against time had only just begun, but Richard felt that, for the first time in years, he was exactly where he needed to be. As Richard and Emily moved quickly through the now chaotic corridors, Emily couldn't help but notice how transformed Richard seemed. The invisible man living in the airport's shadows had given way to a focused, determined professional. It was as if every moment of his life, the years of experience, the time on the streets, even the daily humiliations, had prepared him for this moment. "This way," Richard whispered, pulling Emily behind an abandoned luggage cart as a group of security guards ran past. "They'll use the service route. It's the only one that makes sense now." The sound of sirens and evacuation announcements created a soundscape that helped them move unnoticed. Richard led the way with surprising confidence, each movement calculated to maximize his invisibility, a skill the streets had taught him and that now could save hundreds of lives. The pain in his arm was increasing, but Richard ignored it. There was too much at stake to worry about superficial injuries. Besides, he was used to pain, physical and emotional. What drove him now was something greater than his own comfort or safety. "Emily," he said as they approached a service door, "if something goes wrong, if I can't—" "Don't even think about it," she interrupted firmly. "We'll make it." Richard nodded, grateful for the young woman's determination. Together, they formed an unlikely pair. The invisible homeless man and the aspiring security supervisor, united by a mission that would test not only their courage, but also their faith in humanity. The clock read 5:30 p.m. 15 minutes to the decisive moment, and the true challenge was yet to come. The evacuation had transformed the airport into a chaotic labyrinth of flashing red emergency lights and shifting shadows. Richard and Emily moved quickly through the service corridors, guided by the intimate knowledge Richard had acquired during his months living in the terminal's shadows. "This way," Richard whispered, pulling Emily into a side hallway as a group of security guards rushed past. The access to Gate 23 has 3 main routes during an evacuation. 2 of them will be blocked by the emergency protocols, leaving only the basement service tunnel, Emily completed, starting to grasp the logic. But how can you be so sure they know about that route? Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, letting out a weary sigh. Because it's the same route I used to move around unseen. And that fake maintenance worker? He wasn't there by chance. They have someone on the inside, someone who knows the system as well as I do. As they descended a dimly lit service stairwell, Richard felt every muscle in his body protest. The wound on his arm throbbed, and decades of life on the streets had taken a toll on his knees. But the adrenaline kept him moving, driven by the urgency of his mission. The airport's basement was a world unto itself, a complex network of maintenance tunnels and ventilation ducts known to few. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and damp, and the distant echo of the evacuation sirens created a surreal atmosphere. How did you discover all these pathways? Emily asked as they navigated another narrow corridor. Necessity, Richard replied, his voice low and pensive. In the early days on the streets, I learned quickly that survival means knowing every escape, every refuge. The airport has its own rules, its own rhythms. I've spent months mentally mapping every corridor, every service door. He paused, a bitter smile crossing his face. Ironic how this knowledge, born of my misfortune, can now save lives. A metallic noise echoed in the distance, causing them both to freeze. Richard signaled for Emily to hide behind a large electrical panel as voices approached. 3 men hurried past the adjacent corridor, carrying backpacks identical to the one Richard had seen earlier. It's them, Emily whispered, her body tense with apprehension. Should we alert security now? Richard shook his head. Not yet. We need to make sure we've found all of them. If we alert them too soon and there are more accomplices? He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. They continued to follow the men at a safe distance, each step calculated to minimize sound. Richard moved with a surprising grace for his age, his years on the streets having taught him the art of true invisibility. The group ahead stopped at a junction of tunnels, and Richard and Emily could hear fragments of their hushed conversation. Electrical system compromised? Need to switch to Plan B? The words were disjointed, but enough to confirm Richard's fears. They're going to try something different, he murmured to Emily. The failure in the electrical system has forced them to change their strategy. Emily checked her watch. 5:35 p.m. 10 minutes until the terrorists' original plan time. What do we do now? Richard watched carefully as a 4th man, wearing a security uniform, joined the group. His heart sank as he recognized the badge. It was not a forgery but a genuine airport security uniform. We have a bigger problem than we thought, he whispered. That's a real security guard. They have someone planted inside the security team itself. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. As a trainee supervisor, she understood the implications of this revelation. It meant the security protocols were compromised, that they couldn't trust the official channels. Richard watched the group discuss for a few more moments before splitting up and heading in different directions. They're separating. That changes everything. Why? Emily asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Because now it's not just one bomb we have to worry about, Richard explained, his voice grave. They have a contingency plan. Likely multiple targets? The weight of this realization hit them both like a punch to the gut. The situation, already critical, had become exponentially more complex. It was no longer just a matter of preventing a single terrorist act, but of dismantling a much more sophisticated operation. We need help, Emily said, her voice quivering slightly. We can't handle this on our own. Richard nodded slowly, his mind racing. Yes, but we have to be very careful about who we involve. With an infiltrator in security, any wrong move could tip them off. That's when they heard more footsteps approaching, accompanied by the sound of radio communications. Richard pulled Emily behind a stack of maintenance crates, just in time to see a security team rush by. Evacuation is nearly complete, one of them said into the radio. Main area clear, proceeding with final sweep. Richard's stomach twisted. With the evacuation, the airport would be an empty labyrinth, the perfect setting for the terrorists to execute their altered plan. They needed to act quickly, but they also needed to be smart. Emily, he said, turning to the young woman with a determined expression. Remember when you asked me why I'm doing this? Why I'm risking everything? She nodded, confused by the sudden change in subject. Because sometimes being invisible is a superpower, he continued, a different gleam in his eyes. "And now, I'm going to show you how to use that to our advantage." The clock read 5:38 p.m. Somewhere above them, hundreds of people were being evacuated from the airport, entirely oblivious to the drama unfolding in the underground tunnels. Richard knew that the next decisions they made could determine not just the success or failure of his mission, but the life or death of countless innocents. And so, in the depths of the airport, an unlikely duo prepared to execute an even more unlikely plan. A plan that would depend not on strength or technology, but on the only thing Richard had perfected in his years on the streets: the art of being invisible when all eyes are searching elsewhere. "What do you mean, use invisibility to our advantage?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper in the dimly lit corridor. Richard smiled, a different light in his weary eyes. "4 months I've been ignored by everyone in this airport. Guards, staff, passengers, they all saw me as part of the scenery, a shadow that didn't deserve attention. But you know what else is often overlooked besides the homeless?" He gestured to the walls around them, to the service uniforms hanging in a half-open locker, to the cleaning carts abandoned during the evacuation. "The cleaning staff, the maintenance crew, the behind-the-scenes people," Emily completed, starting to understand. "People see them but they don't really see them." "Exactly. And thanks to months of observing every shift, every routine, I know exactly how they move, how they talk, how they behave." Richard began rummaging through the uniform locker. "It's time for us to truly become invisible, not by being ignored, but by blending in perfectly." Minutes later, Emily could barely recognize the man in front of her. Richard, now wearing a full maintenance uniform, had completely transformed his posture. The way he held the tools, the way he adjusted the utility belt, every gesture exuded the natural competence of someone who had spent decades in the trade. "You too," he said, handing Emily a custodial uniform. "Your security badge is too visible now. We need to be people that no one looks at twice." As Emily adjusted to her new identity, Richard explained the plan. "They've split into 4 groups. From what I've seen of the uniforms and equipment, they're posing as different service teams. That means they're using our own systems against us. How will we find them all?" Emily asked, fixing her new uniform. "We won't, not yet," Richard replied, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "First, we need to understand the full plan. And for that, we'll use something I learned on the streets. Sometimes the best intel comes not from overhearing conversations, but from observing patterns." Richard guided Emily through the service corridors, now moving with more confidence in their disguises. Whenever they encountered other staff evacuating, they simply waved and continued on their way, perfectly invisible in their very visibility. "Look," Richard whispered, pointing to almost imperceptible marks on the walls. "Signals. They're using a marking system to communicate. I learned to recognize stuff like this on the streets. Gangs and criminal groups often leave markings to coordinate actions." Emily examined the marks with growing concern. "Can you decipher them?" "Some," Richard replied, his eyes scanning the walls. "This one indicates a meeting point. And that one is more worrying. It's a time symbol. They've changed the schedule." The clock read 5:42 p.m. The original time they had overheard was approaching, but now Richard suspected it was merely a distraction. That's when they heard voices approaching. Richard pulled Emily into a maintenance room, leaving the door ajar. Through the crack, they watched 2 men pass by carrying cleaning equipment. "Confirmed change. New time, 6:15, one of them said in a low voice. "All points aligned?" "Yes." The evacuation was a setback, but it worked in our favor. "With the terminal empty?" The voices trailed off down the corridor, but Richard's blood ran cold. 6:15. They've not only changed the location, they've given themselves more time to prepare something bigger. Emily nervously checked her watch. "We have just over 30 minutes. What are they planning?" Richard frowned, his mind racing. "Think with me, why choose 6:15? What's special about that time?" He pulled from his bag, now disguised as a tool bag, the worn notebook where he had been recording his airport observations for months. Flipping through it quickly, his eyes widened. "Here," he said, pointing to a page with noted schedules. 6:15 is when the security systems transition to the night shift. There's a window of about 3 minutes when the cameras reboot." "How do you know that?" Emily asked, impressed. "When you live in the shadows, you learn to notice these patterns. I needed to know those schedules to move unseen." Richard snapped the notebook shut. "But they're not planning to hide, they're planning to use that window to act simultaneously at multiple points." A metallic sound echoed down the corridor, followed by raised voices. Richard and Emily exchanged a look. something was happening. "Come on," Richard whispered, moving towards the sound. "But remember, we're invisible. No matter what we see, we have to keep the disguise." They made their way down the corridor, now moving with the confidence of regular staff on their rounds. As they reached a junction of tunnels, they saw something that made their hearts race. Several groups converging, each carrying different equipment. "It's a coordination meeting," Richard murmured, pretending to check a nearby electrical panel. "They're synchronizing the final details." Emily, feigning floor cleaning nearby, was able to overhear fragments of the conversation. Loose words that, together, began to form a terrifying picture of what was to come. "We need to do something," she whispered urgently. "Yes," Richard replied, his voice laden with determination. "But first, we need to understand exactly what they're planning. And for that," he smiled slightly, "we'll do what the invisible do best: observe without being noticed." The clock continued its relentless march. 5:45 p.m. Somewhere above them, the airport was nearly completely evacuated, transformed into a perfect stage for whatever was about to happen. And in the shadows of the service tunnels, a former homeless man and a young security supervisor prepared for their greatest test. The art of invisibility was about to be put to the ultimate test, and Richard knew the next decisions they made could determine not just their own fate, but that of everyone in the airport. The power of the invisible was about to be revealed. The group of terrorists was gathered in a tense circle, exchanging final instructions in the depths of the terminal. The dim light of the emergency lamps cast dancing shadows on their determined faces, as Richard and Emily, still in their maintenance worker disguises, managed to catch crucial fragments of the conversation. Richard's heart was pounding so hard he feared it could be heard as he pretended to work on a nearby electrical panel. "Points A, B, and C must be perfectly synchronized," ordered a man with a deep voice, his authority evident in every word. "When the cameras reboot at 6:15, everything must be in position. We can't have any mistakes." Richard felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the man. It was the same infiltrated security guard they had seen before. Now, wearing a different uniform, he clearly commanded the operation with the coldness of someone accustomed to giving orders that could not be questioned. "Have the explosives been modified for the new plan?" another asked, their voice betraying a slight accent that Richard couldn't place. "Yes." "With the electrical system compromised, we'll use the secondary access points." The leader smiled, an expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. "The impact will be even greater. The evacuation has given us an opportunity we couldn't have planned better." Emily cast a desperate look at Richard, her hands trembling slightly as she pretended to make notes on a worn clipboard. The situation was exponentially worse than they had imagined. It wasn't just an isolated attack, but a coordinated series of planned explosions intended to cause maximum destruction. "We need help," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silence of the tunnels. "We can't stop 3 simultaneous explosions. It's impossible." Richard nodded discreetly, his mind racing as decades of experience with electrical systems converged on an idea. It was risky, bordering on suicidal, but it might work if executed perfectly. "The points they've chosen," he murmured, taking advantage of the noise from a nearby pipe to mask his voice, "must be connected to the same main power system. That's why they need the window when the cameras reboot. It's the exact moment the backup power also switches." "And how does that help us?" Emily asked, her eyes never leaving the group of terrorists. "Because there's a flaw in that system, one I discovered during my years as a supervisor. If we can access the master distribution panel." Richard abruptly cut off his explanation as one of the terrorists approached, their heavy footsteps echoing in the concrete corridor. The man stopped a few feet away from them, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He was tall, with a thin scar cutting across his left eyebrow, and something in his posture indicated military training. "Hey, you two. What are you doing here? The area should be completely evacuated." Richard kept his cool, years on the streets having taught him to lie convincingly when his life depended on it. "Final systems check," he responded, his voice adopting the bored tone of an employee fulfilling another routine workday task. "Direct order from central maintenance after the power failure. They want to make sure we won't have any more surprises." The terrorist took another step forward, his calculating gaze evaluating every detail of their disguises. "Let me see your authorization." This was the moment when everything fell apart. A flash of recognition crossed the man's eyes as he fixed his gaze on Emily. He had identified her from the previous confrontation. The world seemed to slow down as Richard watched the terrorist's hand move towards the hidden weapon under his fake uniform. In a move born of desperation and decades of survival instinct, Richard knocked over a heavy tool cart between them. The metallic crash echoed through the tunnels like a gunshot, tools scattering across the floor in a chaotic rain of metal. "Intruders!" The terrorist's shout reverberated off the walls, followed by the distinctive sound of multiple weapons being drawn. "Run!" Richard pushed Emily towards a side corridor as the first shots cut through the air, ricocheting off the concrete walls with deafening cracks. They ran in a zigzag pattern, Richard guiding them through a series of tunnels he knew intimately after months of living in their shadows. The airport's underground labyrinth, which had been his refuge for so long, now became their only hope for survival. Every turn, every intersection, every service door that Richard had memorized in his lonely nights could mean the difference between life and death. "This way," he panted, pulling Emily into a narrow ventilation duct partially hidden by stacked boxes. The space was claustrophobically tight, but offered temporary cover as sounds of pursuit echoed through the corridors. "We need to reach the master control panel. It's our only chance now. They'll find us," Emily said between gasping breaths, her face pale in the dim duct. "There are too many of them and now they know we're here." "Not in these tunnels," Richard replied with a confidence born of desperation. "There are hundreds of branches and I know each one. I've spent months mapping this place, finding routes even the staff don't know about." He checked his watch, the digital numbers glowing faintly, 6:05 p.m. Just 10 minutes until the critical moment that could determine the fate of hundreds of lives. It was then that a plan began to crystallize in his mind, dangerous, nearly suicidal, but possibly their only chance. "Emily," he said, his voice taking on a controlled urgency, "I need you to do something for me. Something extremely dangerous." Over the next few minutes, Richard detailed his plan. It was risky, depended on perfect timing, and required each of them to execute their part with absolute precision. Emily listened intently, her eyes widening as she grasped the magnitude of what Richard was proposing. "You can't do this alone," she protested vehemently. "It's too dangerous. Practically suicidal." "I have no choice," Richard replied, a sad smile forming on his weathered face. "Besides, who'd notice one more homeless man if something goes wrong? I'm invisible, remember?" "I would," Emily said firmly, tears gleaming in her eyes. "I'd notice. And I won't let you sacrifice yourself like that." The sound of voices and approaching footsteps interrupted the moment. It was time to act. Richard pulled the well-worn notebook from his backpack that had been his constant companion for months on the streets. Its pages were filled with meticulous diagrams of the airport's electrical system, notes on security routines, and detailed maps of the service tunnels. "Everything you need to know is in here," he said, handing the notebook to Emily with hands that trembled slightly. "The diagrams, the routes, the system's weak points. If I don't make it..." "You will," Emily interrupted firmly, though her own tears threatened to fall. "You have to." Richard allowed himself a moment of emotion, seeing in the young woman's eyes the same determination he had once seen in his own reflection, before life on the streets had transformed him into a shadow. Then he squared his shoulders and resumed the focused expression that had characterized his years as a maintenance supervisor. "Remember, 6:15 on the dot. Not a second before, not a second after. Everything depends on that timing." They separated, each following their own path in the dark tunnels with a clear mission. Richard could hear the terrorists organizing, splitting into groups to methodically search the corridors. He smiled bitterly. They didn't know these tunnels like he did. They didn't know about the shortcuts discovered on brutal winter nights, the secret passages found on pitiless rainy days, the blind spots that had been his salvation so many times. The clock read 6:10 p.m. when Richard finally reached his destination, the master distribution panel, the true heart of the airport's electrical system. It was an imposing structure that covered an entire wall, a labyrinth of switches, breakers, and indicators flashing red and green like a spacecraft control panel. As his skilled fingers worked the circuits with the precision of a surgeon, Richard allowed his mind to briefly wander through his life. He thought about how he had lost everything, his job, Margaret, his dignity. How he had become invisible to a society that preferred not to see its failures and forgotten. And now, by a cruel twist of fate, that very invisibility could be the key to saving hundreds of lives. 6:13 p.m. Voices echoed through the corridors, growing ever closer. Richard continued his methodical work, his fingers moving with the precision honed over decades dealing with complex electrical systems. Each connection had to be perfect, each adjustment exact. 6:14 p.m. Heavy footsteps in the adjacent hallway. Richard made the final critical adjustments, his heart pounding in his chest with enough force to compete with the hum of the equipment around him. His entire future, and that of hundreds of others, depended on the next few seconds. 6:15 p.m. The lights flickered as the system began its scheduled transition. Richard closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and with a silent prayer, pulled the final lever. The entire airport plunged into darkness. Absolute darkness enveloped the airport for precisely 3 seconds, just long enough for the backup systems to attempt to start and fail due to the modifications Richard had made. The plan was working exactly as he had envisioned, transforming his expertise with electrical systems and knowledge of the tunnels into a precise weapon against terror. As the emergency lights began to flash erratically, creating a strobe-like show through the corridors, chaos erupted among the terrorists. Their plans, which depended on precise synchronization with the electrical system, were completely compromised. Panic began to spread among them like a virus. "The detonators," one of them shouted, his voice echoing through the tunnels. "The timing circuit is unstable. Nothing is responding." Richard allowed himself a small smile in the darkness, knowing that his jury-rigged sabotage had worked perfectly. The changes he had made to the master panel not only affected the power, but also created an electromagnetic overload that interfered with any electronic device within a 50-meter radius, including remote detonators and communication systems. Richard's 25 years as a maintenance supervisor, combined with months of observing every airport detail from the shadows, had become a crucial advantage. Each reconnected wire, each modified circuit had been calculated to create maximum interference with minimal permanent damage. Somewhere in the tunnels, Emily executed her part of the plan with military precision. Richard had given her specific instructions on which breakers to activate and in what sequence, creating a domino effect that would transform the airport's electrical system into an unpredictable maze of unstable power. The terrorists, now in complete desperation, began acting impulsively, exactly as Richard had predicted. In the chaos and confusion, they abandoned all pretense of discretion, their voices echoing through the corridors in a mix of languages and curses. "Abort," the leader's voice thundered through the tunnels. "Retrieve the equipment. We need to get out of here now." It was at this moment that the second part of Richard's plan went into action. The security doors, programmed to lock automatically in the event of a complete power failure, began closing one by one with a menacing metallic sound, isolating different sections of the tunnels. Richard moved silently through the now partially lit corridors, each step calculated with the precision only someone intimately familiar with every inch of the space could possess. He knew exactly which doors to avoid, which corridors would remain accessible, which route to take to maximize his advantage. Gunshots echoed through the tunnels as the desperate terrorists tried to shoot the door locks. Richard knew it was futile. The security doors were designed to withstand much more than conventional ammunition. Each wasted shot was another sign that his plan was working. "Richard?" Emily's urgent whisper came from somewhere to his right. He found her hidden behind a large transformer, her young face lit by the flickering emergency lights. Her eyes shone with a mix of fear and determination. "It worked," she said, holding out her trembling phone. "I managed to send the message to the outer team before the communication system went down. They're on their way. Tactical teams, negotiators, the whole anti-terror protocol is being activated." Richard nodded gravely but knew it wasn't over yet. "The explosives," he said, his voice laden with urgency. "We need to find them before someone tries a manual detonation. If they realize they have no way out." A deafening boom shook the tunnel walls, interrupting his words. Someone had tried to force one of the doors with some kind of smaller explosive. The sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices indicated at least part of the group was heading in their direction. This way, Richard guided Emily through a narrow ventilation duct, so tight they had to crawl. "It will take us to the secondary control room. From there we can monitor the whole sector without being seen." As they crawled through the claustrophobic space, Richard couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. The same tunnels and passages that had been his refuge during months of misery and isolation were now helping to save hundreds of innocent lives. In the secondary control room, grainy security camera feeds showed several terrorists trapped in different tunnel sections, isolated from each other by the security doors Richard had strategically activated. "There?" Emily pointed to one of the screens, her voice tense. 3 men, including the leader, had managed to reach a maintenance area where several backpacks were stacked against the wall. "That's the explosives. They must be trying to reconfigure them for manual detonation." Richard studied the layout of the location for a moment, his decades of experience allowing him to quickly assess the situation. "Room 47B. I know a way to get there without using the main corridors." He hesitated for a moment, weighing his next words. Emily, you need to go find the intervention team. They're going to need someone who knows the full situation, someone who can guide them through the tunnels. I'm not leaving you alone, she protested vehemently, grasping his arm. It's suicide. I'm not asking for permission, Richard replied with a weary smile that carried the weight of all his experiences. I've lived my life, Emily. If anything goes wrong... Stop that right now, she interrupted, tears glistening in her eyes. You're not invisible to me, Richard. Never were. And I'm not going to let you sacrifice yourself like your life is worth less than the others. The moment of intense emotion was interrupted by another distant boom, followed by frustrated shouts echoing through the tunnels. Richard placed his hands on Emily's shoulders, looking directly into her eyes. Go. Do what needs to be done. I promise I'll be careful, but I have to stop them from detonating those explosives, even if it's the last thing I do. It's the only way to ensure no one gets hurt. Emily briefly embraced him, her tears dampening the false uniform he still wore, before reluctantly departing. Richard watched her disappear down the corridor, carrying with her his hopes that his entire plan would not be in vain. Moving with the silent agility years on the streets had taught him, Richard approached room 47B through a series of rarely used maintenance passages. Through a ventilation grate, he could see the three terrorists desperately trying to reconfigure the detonators, their faces lit by the dim glow of flashlights. It's useless, the leader said, frustration evident in his normally controlled voice. The electrical interference is too strong. We have to do it manually. We have no choice. Richard watched in horror as one of the men began modifying one of the devices, clearly preparing it for immediate detonation. His years of experience with circuitry told him they were about to do something catastrophically dangerous. It was now or never. With a calculated move, he activated the final circuit he had prepared, his last gambit. The lights in the room flickered violently before exploding in a shower of sparks, plunging the environment into total darkness. The chaos that followed was amplified by the sudden sound of heavy boots and commanding voices yelling "Police! Freeze!" as the intervention team finally arrived, guided by Emily. Gunfire was exchanged in the darkness, screams echoing through the corridors, and the sound of falling bodies mixed with the noise of tactical equipment. When the emergency lights finally stabilized, revealing the scene like a dramatic tableau, the three terrorists were subdued, the explosives secure, and Emily coordinating the security teams with the competence of a veteran. Richard watched it all from his hiding place, a weary smile on his weathered face. It was over. After so long being invisible, treated as less than human, he had done something that truly mattered. Richard? Emily's voice called softly. You can come out now. It's done. He emerged slowly from the shadows that had been his home for so long, his legs trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The officers looked at him with a mix of curiosity and respect as Emily explained his crucial role in thwarting the attack. In the hours that followed, Richard was treated not as a homeless person, but as the hero he was. His intimate knowledge of the airport's electrical systems and tunnels had saved countless lives. The story of the homeless man who prevented a terrorist attack spread quickly, touching hearts and changing perspectives on those society chooses to overlook. 2 weeks later, Richard adjusted the tie of his new uniform in front of the mirror, now as the official security consultant of the airport, with a salary, benefits, and most importantly, his pride restored. Emily, promoted to senior supervisor after the incident, smiled as she saw him through the reflection. How do you feel? She asked, knowing the question carried much more weight than her simple words suggested. Richard looked out the terminal window, watching the planes take off against the blue dawn sky. A new day, a new beginning. Visible, he replied simply, his voice carrying the weight of all the experiences that had led him there. And there, in that moment of quiet triumph, Richard understood a fundamental truth. Sometimes you need to get lost in the shadows to find your true light. His journey had proven that no one is truly invisible, just an opportunity, a moment of courage, a way from shining and showing their true worth. The airport continued its relentless rhythm, with thousands of people passing through its corridors daily. But now, as Richard walked these same corridors in his new uniform, he was no longer a shadow to be ignored. He was a living reminder that heroes can arise from the most unlikely places, and that every person, no matter their situation, carries within them the potential to make a difference. And so, friends, what did you think of this emotional story? Don't forget to leave your comments telling us what you felt following Richard's journey. If you enjoyed it and want more intense stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. This helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you more thrilling adventures. Until the next story.